Good afternoon. Thank you for coming today. You know, we're here to celebrate the lives of 5 really great people who are also Rotarians. So, you know, hey, thank you for coming. They were close friends to many of us, and we cherish their memories. Ralph, thank you for coming today and for giving our message. So with that, let's start our service.
Thank you, Dan. I'm going to remove my mask because I think I'm more than 6 feet, and although some of you won't want to hear me, I'm going to try and make myself audible. Let me add my welcome also to Joan and Kate for honoring us with your presence today, and thank you, Dodie, for arranging great weather this week and for arranging this memorial service where we come to honor the lives of 5 fellow Rotarians who have departed us in this past year to go to their eternal reward. And we are going to honor Jim Burchett, Mike Davis, Mary Evans, John Green, and Joe Westpizer. And it could be a little while, so I'm going to dismiss our flag bearers to go ahead and have a seat at this time if you would like, and we will come back later. Can you hear me, Tim? It's customary at a memorial service to read the obituary of those who have passed, but since we have 5 people today to honor, to remember, rather than read obituaries, I thought it would be appropriate that we share our memories of how they lived among us and how they contributed to us. And in a few minutes, you'll all have an opportunity to share your own personal memories about how our departed Rotarians affected your lives. So be thinking about those moments when these friends touched your life, the lives of others, exemplified our Rotarian goal of service above self. And please share your memories with all of us. You can feel free to stand where you are, unhook your mask if you like, come up here, whichever you're comfortable with when we come to share. So this afternoon, we gather to celebrate their lives and to honor their memories. I'll introduce each person one by one and give some background information, and then invite you to add your own remembrances, and we'll go in alphabetical order. And I don't know who's going to light the candles. Are we going to try and do that in this wind? We'll light first candle for Jim Burchett. If you would come, Susie, and do that, please. Thank you, dear. Jim joined our club in 1982. That means he had 38 years in the Oxford Rotary Club. What you may not realize is that coming to Miami to teach in educational leadership was a second career completely for Jim Burchett. Jim started out teaching 7th grade, coaching basketball and softball back in 1951. I was 9 years old when he started. He rose through the ranks as not only a school teacher, but an elementary school principal, a junior high school principal, a high school principal, and he was superintendent of 2 school districts in Michigan, Mount Blanc and Port Huron, 17,000 student school district. After finishing a full 30-year career in education in Illinois and Michigan, Jim brought his expertise to Miami University to pass his knowledge and his expertise along to graduate students in educational leadership. Here at Miami, will come as no surprise, Jim taught the practical courses. No philosophy, no theory. He taught applied courses like business affairs and fiscal resources, personal staff administration, advanced collective bargaining, and board, superintendent, and staff relations. When I was a student in that department, he was one of my profs, and I could tell you stories about board, superintendent, and staff relations, but we have 5 people to talk about today. Jim was the assistant departmental chair of educational leadership. He chaired the Ohio Administrator Licensure Committee. Jim was a Paul Harris Fellow, but he also endowed a doctoral fellowship to support doctoral students who set aside their careers and incomes in order to pursue leadership roles in public education. Anyone who knew Jim knew he was no nonsense, straightforward, all business, and we could always count on Jim for his full support in every Rotary project we took on. I'd like to invite any of you to share a memory that you have of Jim, how he affected you, something that he did as we honor him today, how his life gave evidence of the Norway test. Warren, I see you're eager to speak. Please stand.
Well, I didn't know Jim well, but I did know this. Every single time I talked to him, he told me that he ran, jogged a mile and a quarter, or a mile and a half every day. And he looked at me like, you hear that? Which I always regarded as a favor.
Please do.
Many people say that you can learn a lot about a person if you play a round of golf with them. And when I retired, I was invited by John Green and to join this group, and Jim Burchett was one of my first partners. I was in a cart with him. And not knowing the group, how they played, I remember, I don't forget the exact situation, but I said, Jim, if we do this, what would that be? He looked at me strange and said, that'd be a stroke. And so, in other words, you know, there was no messing around. The ball was there, you play it as it lies. And sometimes you're with people that they, you know, particularly an older group, they'll make some accommodations. Nope, he said, that'd be a stroke. And so I learned a lot about Jim Burchett in that 1 minute.
Bob?
A little interesting fun fact about Jim Burchett is I believe that he was a semi-professional baseball player. He played professional baseball, okay, semi-pro. And back in the 1990s, we had a softball team. Rotary put together a team at the old Tri, and I'm not sure if we're playing Kiwanis or Lions or somebody, but we had this old guy. That's who I thought he was, just this old guy, Jim Burchett. Was like, I'll do it, I'll play. Well, how can he play? You know, he's going to help getting from home plate to first base, you know. But he gets up there and he hits the ball every time. And just an amazing baseball player. Then I come to find out that he played semi-professional baseball. So he had an edge. So that's a neat little fun fact about Jim Burchett.
Anybody else? As I was putting this together, Rosemarie reminded me that on the corner of 732 and Chestnut, there's now a very nice set of condos there. The Burchetts lived the first house on the left as you entered White Oak. And before that condos were developed, there was one of the most magnificent elderberry trees right there. Rosemary and I like elderberries. We make maps of where we see them growing in the spring. We used to go back and get them because we like to do elderberry jelly. Some people make pies with them. We don't have enough patience. We were there cutting off the elderberries from the tree, and Jim came out of his house. He stood there and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "We're cutting elderberries." He said, "Going to make wine. Bring me some." Our next Rotarian that we honor today is Mike Davis. Jody, if you would come and light the second candle. Mike was among us as a Rotarian for all too short 13 years. He joined the club in 2007, and we all remember when he was president in 2010, 2011. Mike almost always had a smile on his face. If there had been a Best Dressed Rotarian award, he'd have won it every year, hands down, right? He was always well known for how well he dressed with suspenders paired with each suit. Someone said if you looked up the word dapper in the dictionary, it'd be Mike Davis's picture. We all know Mike is treasurer or chief fiscal officer of Ohio's geographically largest school district. But Mike's work did not stop at Talawanda. He continued with his work as part of the Butler Health Plan, Board of Optimal Health Initiatives, and chairman of the Ohio School Plan. These organizations that Mike was part of and led at times work for lower costs for insurance, for quality coverage for schools and employees in Butler County and throughout Ohio. Many distinctives set Mike apart. Not just a skilled CPA who kept Talawanda District solvent, Mike was also adept at securing maximum additional capital funding from the state. He knew how to take advantage of matching funds, and then, like it wasn't enough to oversee this large district, he managed the capital projects themselves. That always amazed me, that he was able to extend himself to that point. He made the Oxford community attractive, competitive, with the most modern school facilities. We're speaking, of course, the high school and Kramer Elementary. As I reflect on Mike, one quality that made him so special as a school treasurer was that Mike consistently put students, classroom staff, and the community at the focus of his fiscal decision making. It was the heart of what kept him moving. Multi-talented, multifaceted, super nice guy, Mike left an incredible legacy of good deeds for Oxford. And I would like to invite any of you to share your thoughts as well about Mike Davis this afternoon. Lee?
So when Rosemary and I first came to town and I was appointed to an Oxford committee with Mike, we looked at each other pretty intently for the first 3 or 4 meetings. And about the 5th meeting into this multi-year program, he said, "I know you." And I said, "You know what, when we sat down, I thought I knew you too." And as it turned out, Mike Davis and I were on the train to New York probably 100 times over a period of maybe 20 years. I usually got on in Trenton and he usually got on in Princeton Junction. And from that moment on, neither of us could do any wrong. We all knew where we were coming from, and I agree with your sentiments. He saw it, he analyzed it, he called it like it was and what it needed to be. And I'll always admire him for that. You know, commuters get to know each other sometimes better than their own families, and for those of you that have never been an urban commuter, you would be surprised at the number of things that commuters know about your family that you haven't even told your own family. And that's a bond that only commuters will understand, and I'll always remember him for that and for his pride of his son. Every time his son got promoted in the Army, he called me, and I always appreciate him for that.
Tim Derrickson, good to see you. Thanks for coming.
Well, I was just going to mention with Mike. You know, I knew Mike all my life. He was a few years older than me, so I always looked up to Mike, and he was a great athlete at Talawanda, and he continued his weightlifting and just healthy activity throughout his entire life. And when Mike passed, it was just a shock, because I just always looked up to Mike because he cared for us. Ralph mentioned how good of a treasure Mike was. Mike did have a reputation in Columbus in K-12 education just to be a very good treasurer, and everyone that I interacted with in Columbus knew Mike to be an exceptional treasurer, which always just made me very proud to have worked in Columbus and the reputation that Mike had. I just loved calling him my friend, because so many people really looked up to him. But I was always a little bit jealous of what he could do in the weight room. I guess that'll never change, but he left a beautiful family, as you all know, Crystal as well as Mike, many of you do, and I'm going to miss him. Thanks, Ralph.
Thank you. Bill Schilling, please.
I don't do too well at these because I always get emotional, but kind of a Rotary story as much as a Mike Davis story. People ask, you know, this guy passed away. Oh, he was in Rotary. Oh, was he your friend? It's like, well, I on purpose sat by the guy every Wednesday for 13 years. So I guess he was my friend. And you don't really think about that so much because, like, you guys, we don't necessarily get together at night. Some of us do, and Crystal, Mike, and Sherry and I would do some of that, but more so for Rotary things. And you know, you got enough going on that Rotary provides that release cut for you. But like Lee was saying about being on the train, you don't need to get together elsewhere because you're gonna. And this is the problem with COVID now too. You're gonna see your friends on Wednesday anyway to have a laugh and a share a moment. The other part about Mike, he made it his life's work to mock me every Rotary meeting that he could. And I suppose I'm worthy of mockery, but he would make bad comments about me, and I started the Mike Davis Clothing Relief Fund at one point. But Edda came and was setting up the flag routes, and she calls me and said, well, I see that you and Mike Davis are on the same route. Is that going to be a problem? Like, she thought we actually, which is a sign of the best friends ever in a way. So, great memories of the great guy.
I guess if I had to sum up Mike Davis in just a couple of words, it would be servant leader. He was a leader. He never wore his position or authority on his forehead, on his sleeve. When he was president of the club, he was a servant leader. He was one of the guys, but you wanted to follow him wherever he went. He was that kind of guy. Thank you for sharing. That brings us to our dear, beloved Mary Evans. It was lit for a moment. I saw it. Thank you, Bob. Mary came into our club as a Rotarian 31 years ago. It was 1989. And in that time, she became a Paul Harris Fellow 4 times. We remember Mary for her enthusiasm in whatever Rotary project she got involved. When she was into a project, Mary was all in. One that comes to mind was how Mary championed collecting shoes for kids. Remember the big collection box at the meetings? Now have you remembered to bring in your shoes, please? Mary was ever the lady. She never lost her gracious Southern accent. She always reminded me of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. One hot day, I came into Rotary and she was the greeter. She says, "Rather sticky out there, isn't it?" I said, "Mary, I'm sweating." She said, "Oh, Ralph, horses sweat, gentlemen perspire, and ladies feel the heat." Anyone else? Please, Rosemary. Mary.
Oh, Mary was my lunch buddy and my cookie buddy. And we would go around and collect the leftover cookies because, you know, they can't eat them. And we didn't want them to go to waste. And I thank those of you who did not eat your cookie. So Mary and I could have them, and sometimes I had to beg her to take more than 2. Mary, they're going to throw them away. You know, you can have 3, 1 each day, and that was my thing. If I had to give up making cookies, which I used to make, and that's another story, but I figure if I took one, I could have 1 a day. And so that was our treat. But she was the most wonderful lady, and I remember when she had moved into the Knolls and she wasn't coming to Rotary, I would try to take her cookies and drop them off at the house for her. So she was a really special lady, and she was my buddy. I'm gonna miss her.
So I didn't know Mary very well until I got into Rotary, and when I owned the florist, and Mary found that out like 2nd or 3rd meeting. She comes up to me and she says, "Dodie, I have this peace plant, and I'm going away. Can you babysit it for me?" I mean, what are you going to say? I'll take care of the plant. That happened about 3 or 4 times. So then it got to, that plant was not looking very good. Could you come over to the house and take a look at the plant? So I go to the house, take a look at the plant. Well, it needed to be repotted. So I take it home with me. We repot it. We put it into this beautiful pot that she had. Take it back to her. I think that was about the time she really quit traveling so much, so I didn't have to babysit the plant very much. But as far as I know, that plant went to the Knolls with her. So that's my little memory about Mary. Other than I did sit at the table with the cookies also. So when I was on a diet, which was not very often, Mary, you could have my cookie today. And she snatched that cookie right out of my hand.
Thank you, Dodie. Lee.
Ralph, I've got one. This involves Richard.
Take your mask off.
When Mary and Joe, I think, when we first joined the Rotary, were the sergeant at arms, or they were. So Richard used to come over and rub Mary's back, if I remember that. And one day I said, "Mary, what's the deal with Richard rubbing your back?" She said, "Well, how old are you?" And then I told her, she says, "You can rub my back anytime, sweetheart."
Boy, the things you find out at a memorial service.
The thing that always stood out for me about Mary is that when she saw you, she approached you as though you were the one person that she really wanted to see that day. you know, and you know what? She meant it. She meant it. I've never met a more genuine person in my life.
Amen. Genuines are doing great work. Anybody else? Jody, would you like to come and escort Joan to light a candle for John as we honor him next? John joined our club 23 years ago, 1997. We remember well he was our president 2007 to 2008. He was Rotarian of the Year 2009 and 10. And John was gracious enough to fund 3 Paul Harris Fellowships. I think most of us know, but maybe not everybody, that John's a former Navy officer before coming to Oxford. And his ability to provide leadership, pay attention to details, and follow through was evident in everything John accomplished. He was a great champion of our successful annual golf outing fundraisers. Many might say he was Jim Rohr's right-hand man in running those outings. The truth be told, Jim was an idea man. John made it happen. He saw it through. And very successfully, I might add. Everyone always had a great time at those outings, golfers and workers. And John led the effort to keep our whole club organized and helped our club raise a lot of money that was awarded to needy projects. He was always fun to sit with, talk to, and chat with. Very curious, interesting guy. Good questions, good discussions. Anybody have any special thoughts you would like to share about John this afternoon?
Yeah, I've got another one.
Mask off, please, while speaking.
When I lost friends in Vietnam, I created a memorial garden for them wherever I went. And for those of you that know our house, those flags are always lighted, and John saw that. And he came to me and talked to me one day, and he says, you know, that's flag etiquette. And I said, yeah, I know it is. That light is always on. And he said, I'm gonna do that someday. And I don't know if this was before he got sick when your flagpole went up.
Well, just, yeah, it was
He
crazy.
said, I'm going to do that. So John's the only one I know that created a special place in his front yard at the Knolls for an American flag with a solar light on it, so it's always visible. And every time I walk by that, I'm going to think.
Go ahead, Fred.
Go ahead, Fred.
Well,
Your mask
in
off, Daddy.
Can you unhook your mask?
I
We'll
can,
hear
I
you
can,
better.
In the remarks that Ralph made so appropriately, we overlooked one of John's great loves and achievements, and that was his college fraternity. And I can't enumerate all the national offices that John held, but he was the president of the fraternity, the international president, among other responsibilities that he carried on. And I think he never forgot those college days in his fraternity, and he paid his dues back many, many times.
I had the privilege of knowing John in several different avenues. Once again, with golf. Played golf together a number of times. Part of a dinner group. And he get to know a lot about people when you're with them. But the one thing that Joan knows I'm going to say is that over the past number of years, John had a lot of difficulties physically, but you wouldn't have known it. You wouldn't have known it. I always called him my Energizer Bunny, and I really looked up to John because of the way he handled the difficulties that he had. Most of us would have curled up, climbed under a rock, and just said, forget it. John didn't. He went about life as if there was nothing at all wrong. He just went along, and at the service I found out that he said, you know, I've got 2 ladies that are worrying about all that stuff. I don't need to worry about it. And he was he would just and he had some serious situations, and he talked about it like it was, well, you know, I went over there every day this week, be in a chamber, and I'll be there for the next 3 weeks every day in a chamber for however long it was. I forget. And he just kind of took it like, well, that's like going out to play golf. And Fred, you're right. With regard to the fraternity honored him at the service, and they did a nice job on it. He did them a world of good. Thank you.
Well, Dad, I'm surprised you didn't tell the story that you would always tell us. I think, Joan, when I was at that time living in Atlanta, and I would get these phone calls about this family, the Greens, that moved across the street from my parents. And inevitably, in every conversation, John would come up. Damn, that guy's got the toys. I just saw a big boat in his driveway. Oh, you should see his woodworking shop. I mean, John had every toy that there was, didn't he, Dad?
He did.
And Dad used to be so jealous about John and all the neat
Davidson.
toys he had, because Dad didn't have any of those, did you? But that's the first way I got to know about this Mr. Green guy, all his toys.
Susie, I don't think you were back here in Rotary at the time, but while your cottage was being built, every week we would get a report how much was done and how much was left. He would let John know. They're putting the roof on this week, they're doing this week, they're doing that. He was eager to have John as a neighbor. Rosemary.
Yeah, speaking of John and his toys, I am so envious of his little blue scooter that he would drive to Rotary. And I thought that was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Do you still have it?
No, we sold it.
But yeah, he would drive up to Rotary. I says, and when he didn't ride it, I said, John, where's your scooter? You didn't ride your scooter today to Rotary? Oh, it's too windy, or oh, it's too cold. I think he loved that scooter.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Susie, if you would come and escort Kate up to light Joe Westpiser's candle, please. Did it? Well, that candle is a lot like Joe's life. Snuffed out too early. He was 90 when he left us in December. Founding member back in 1955, 55 years in the club. And now that he's gone, I think I can say without embarrassing him in any way, Joe funded 12 Paul Harris fellowships. Clearly, he was a generous philanthropist. Now, for many, many decades, I didn't say years, I said decades, there was an annual 3-way competition for perfect attendance among Joe, Fred Brower, and Bob Miller. I think this endured for over 30 years, perfect attendance. We called them black belt Rotarians. Joe will always be remembered as a man full of passion for life. He never met a stranger. He had a taste for adventure, he loved to travel, and he had a deep appreciation for the arts. Joe's most precious time was what he spent with his family. He was blessed with 3 granddaughters, a grandson, and with, if I'm correct, 4 great-granddaughters. That's good. He touched the lives of many, many people with his generous spirit, and he's greatly missed by all of us. Anybody want to share a personal anecdote? Please, Lee.
About three years ago, Rosemary was in rehab and Joe was in rehab across the hall. They both wanted to talk to each other, but neither of them could hear what he. So I stood in the hall day after day, relaying Rosemary's messages to Joe and relaying Joe's messages back to Rosemary. And it's really amazing how much concern they had for each other during that time when they were both going through a really difficult time. And that's an admirable quality in anyone that has more concern for someone else when you yourself are going through a very difficult time. So I did that for how long, Rosemary, were you up there?
17 days.
17 days. I stood in that hallway.
Well, no, not all 17.
But then,
I could finally get out of bed and
but
I
then,
could go over and
but I
talk
got
to
so tired of this, I started saying things to each of them just to irritate them. And they came out of there actually much closer friends than they might have ever been otherwise. So, you know, a story of difficulty, but a story of humor at the same time, I think can all lift us up.
Norm Harsh.
I was an elementary principal, and we always told the kids, use your playground voice so people can hear you. Well, one time I was at the golf outing, and Joe didn't have a coat, and he got cold, and I had an extra one on a sweatshirt because I knew it was going to be cold out there. So I took it off and gave it to him. That was my first real acquaintance with Joe. And as the years went by, I would watch for him, and I would save him a chair somewhere where I could watch over him and help him in any way I could. Well, my big problem became one when he wanted to have a second cookie. And I'd say to him, Joe, I don't think you should have another cookie. He said, you're worse than my wife.
There you go. That tells it all, buddy. That tells it all, brother.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, John.
You don't know who I am, but I'm Bill Pulley's younger brother. He can't be here today. You know, he's recovering from a broken hip. So what big brothers do, they send little brothers when they can't show up. So anyway, the relationship between Westpeiser and Pulley goes back to Merlin L. Pulley and Joseph Sr. Pulley. They grew up together and had business growth, very lucky growth. If you're successful in business, it takes a lot of luck. Okay? And after the war, you remember the large boom in the building. Everybody wanted a home. They came home with the GI Bill. They could spend it building a home. So Josie Westpeiser Sr. took advantage of that and built a very flourishing business. Dad's concern was, he said, I press pants. he built Capital Banking. So anyway, to skip ahead real quickly, my relationship with the present generation, incidentally, the older I get, it's hard to find someone my age. Is that you, Craig Erickson? Okay, there's a guy I know him. So anyway, when I started my little business in Oxford, we did kind of what Cintas does today. I did what everybody does. You go around and you call on your friends, you know. And I called on the Westmeisers down there, the lumber company, and we called him Bud. You remember when Joe was called Bud? You remember, sir? Well, I guess he got tired of being called his dad's name, so, you know, he went from Bud. No, we called him Bud because he got tired of being called Joe or something. So anyway, what happened was I was starting a new business. You build it by making cold calls. You can't advertise for industrial laundry service. So I called on my friends and I went down to the Westmeisers, and I still will say Bud. We're talking about Joe today. He came up and he said, "Hey, how you doing, Tom?" I said, "Well, I'm starting a new business. We clean these mats for people that walk in the door." He says, "Well, I think we need some of those." I go, "Wow, this is going to be good." Without hesitation, he took all the mats I had in the truck. He said, "Bring them in." He said, "We're doing business with you." He said, "Your dad and my dad had a wonderful friendship, and we're going to have the same friendship." So I'm really here in a long-winded way to say that I have a lot of respect for the Westmeisers. My father did too. And I had a lot of respect for their son, who I still call Bud. Thank you. Any others? Fred and Warren.
Ralph, how much time do we have?
The sun goes down at 7:40.
My first remembrance of Joseph P. Westmeiser was in 1946. Somehow I migrated toward the Purity uptown, which they had 3-2 beer, which was all that was needed to get the girls excited in those days. And I see this guy sitting at a table with about 6 little co-eds around him. And I said, "Who the heck is that guy?" Well, you know who it was, Joe. After that, and that was 1946, he and I went off to the Korean War, and then I returned. Joe did not leave town, and we were invited into a supper group that has met for over 50 years.
60,
Once,
kid.
how many?
Over 60.
Over 60 years, my fellow supper mate. And of course, during that period, we traveled many places and became as close together as any family could be. Unhappily now, we're not many of us left. But Joe was a very active member of that, and his sweetheart who sits beside me. And we have many, many fond remembrance of our relationship with Joe and Katie. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, Fred. Warren?
When I first came to Oxford, I didn't know anybody in the town. I knew some people at the university, but I didn't know anybody much in the town and didn't care much until I got married. Came to town, got married almost immediately thereafter, and sooner or later had twin babies. And we had them when we went over to Luxembourg to set the place up, and then when we came back, we brought these babies. What were we going to do? Bonnie said, "We got to have a house." It's too noisy around here on Withrow Street, and then kids have to sleep. So I went down to Miami Valley. I knew nothing about this. I didn't have any money, and I didn't know anything about houses. But that didn't ever stop me. And so I was talking with Joe and Dick. I was not exactly an easy client because I knew exactly what I wanted. I thought sort of maybe, and Joe was very patient. Dick was a little less patient with my ideas that would probably cost 3 times the size of an ordinary house. But we just kept at it, and I really have always been so indebted to Joe for carrying me through that whole year-long consultation and compromise that finally got us the house that we're still living in, by the way. But that sort of established a kind of a tie between us that always resurfaced from time to time when we saw one another. Always appreciated that, and like Fred said, a certain fondness for the Westpisers as a result.
Thank you.
Craig, please.
Well, when I moved back to Oxford several years ago and joined the Rotary Club, I was happy to see one of the members was Buddy Westpiser. And when I first saw him, I said, "Bud, how you doing?" And he, "Who? Bud. My name's Joe." I think he had changed after a while because I think you're absolutely right. As a kid growing up, Father Joe and then Joe the second, and he had this distinguishing thing. Well, Joe and several of us, I think 5 people in Rotary, shared one thing in common and kind of interesting. We all went to McGuffey High School, grade school and high school, and McGuffey was what's called a progressive education school. So you didn't necessarily have to get an A, B, C, or D to go from one class up to the other. But it was basically just absorbing what you need to absorb. It was, I would say, kind of a liberal arts high school of anything. Well, what that gets around to, I know when Joe got out of high school, or perhaps college, his father sent him to London for, I think, a couple months, something like that. And I think that was one of his highlights, certainly in getting along after college or after school. But all that led to is this great education of McGuffey. He traveled at an early stage in his life. And I always thought that made him such an interesting, conversationally interesting, enlightened type of guy. And I leave part of that to McGuffey, and of course part of it to you, as just really one of those delightful people you're always happy to see. And I must say, no matter what the occasion, Joe would come up with a special, unique comment that you could almost want to write down. It was just always terrific. So I shall always remember Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Is there anybody else? As we have shared our reminiscences of about 5 departed Rotarian friends this afternoon, I think we can all agree that each one's life passed, and I really should say surpassed, the Rotary 4-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all people concerned? Will it build goodwill? And I want to thank you, Joan and Kate, for honoring us with your presence today. I hope you were blessed by the reminiscences and fondness with which we hold Joe and John and all of our fellow Rotarians. Now, as you look around the cemetery, we see on the tombstones the date that person was born and the date they died. On many tombstones, between those 2 dates, there's a dash. That dash, the dash between the dates, represent or sums up their entire life here on Earth. I'd like to read a poem by Linda Ellis. I read of a man who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on the tombstone from the beginning to the end. He noted that first came the date of birth and spoke of the following date with tears. But he said what mattered most of all was the dash between those years. For that dash represents all the time they spent alive on earth, and now only those who love them know what that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters most is how we live and love and how we spend that dash. So think about this long and hard. Are there things you'd like to change? For you never know how much time is left that still can be rearranged. To be less quick to anger, to show appreciation more, and love the people in our lives like we've never loved before. If we treat each other with respect and more often wear a smile, remembering that this special dash might only last a little while. So, when your eulogy is being read, with your life's actions to rehash, would you be proud of the things they say about how you lived your dash? We'll close with a reading of Holy Scripture and prayer. Bow, please. And because we're reading Scripture and praying, I'll ask the gentlemen that remove their hands. From the book of Revelation, we read, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them." We read from the Gospel of John, the 11th chapter. Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies." O God, who gave us birth, you are ever more ready to hear than we are to pray. You know our needs before we even ask. Give to us now your grace, that as we shrink before the mystery of death, we may see the light of eternity. Help us to live as those who are prepared to die. And when our days here are accomplished, enable us to die as those who go forth to live, so that living or dying, our life may be in you through our Savior, Jesus Christ. Close with a benediction from the book of Jude, one of my favorite scriptures. Now to the one who is able to keep you from falling and to make you stand without blemish in the presence of God's glory with rejoicing, to the only God our Savior, through Jesus Christ our Lord, be glory, majesty, power, and authority before all time, now, and forever. And God's people said, Amen. Thank you for coming.